Welcome to Edu 510. In this course, not surprisingly I guess, we will explore the fundamentals of educational research. What does it mean to do research? How is that different than any other information gathering activity we may engage in? Because you do every day, you read newspapers, you talk to friends about the newest thing that's happening, news, etc. But how can we ensure that our actions are ethical as researchers? How do we actually do research? And for what purpose? Well, we're going to begin this exploration in Module 1, and by the end of the course, my goal is that you will, and I'm sure your goal is, that you will feel much more confident about your ability to pursue your research question thoughtfully, knowledgeably, and ethically. To help us in that task, we're going to primarily be using the Creswell and Guterman text, but it will be supplemented with other readings along the way, as you'll see on the eClass reading site. The book that we're going to be using, or the text that we're going to be using, is Educational Research, Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Qualitative and Quantitative Research. We're using the 6th edition. Up until this year, we've used the 5th edition, but we have changed over to the 6th edition to ensure that it's as up to date as possible. It was produced in 2018. And the authors are John Creswell, the professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a very, very well-known research specialist. He researches research, essentially. And his work is quoted probably every thesis that I've ever read, every examining committee I've ever been on, Creswell's name comes up somewhere along the line because he is very well known, particularly in the field of educational research. Tim Guterman is an assistant professor of the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Michigan. And it may seem odd that we would have somebody from the Department of Family Medicine, but interestingly enough, medicine is undergoing a little bit of a research renaissance, and particularly in areas like family medicine, nursing, that sort of thing. There has been a growth in things like qualitative research, mixed methods, etc. And Tim Guterman is working just as Creswell does in looking specifically at research as a topic of research. And so that's what his work is at the University of Michigan. We will begin with the first 2 chapters of the text, as well as an additional paper by Creswell, which you can access by going to the link in Module 1 that says Module 1 Readings, and it's also linked under the tab Readings in Module 1. That is the additional Creswell reading on eClass. The text, of course, is a text that you purchase. In order to become familiar with one of the key skills of a good researcher, that is, observation, your first assignment will be to complete Part A of the observation assignment. Your instructions under the assignment tab are minimal on purpose so that you experience in a small way the kinds of decisions a researcher must make. So I often get questions like, well, where should I research? What should I be looking for? What should I be looking at, etc. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of help, unlike most other situations, when you ask those kinds of questions, because the whole point is for you to have the experience of trying to sort that out for yourself and come up with reasons why you might do that as opposed to something else. The activity is actually completed with a Part B, and you won't get instructions for Part B until you've finished Part A, and there's a reason for that as well that will become clear when you see the instructions for Part B. So this whole activity is a little bit mysterious, but the reasons will become obvious soon enough. So don't worry about that. It will work its way through, and we will work our way through this activity. And it always ends up being one that everybody really quite enjoys and goes back to as we go through some of the other readings and activities during the course. At the heart of the course are 2 questions. What is research? And how do we do research well? And I'm sure those are 2 questions that you're asking yourself. Most of us have some idea of what research is, but many people ourselves probably included, at least when we first begin, don't have a really clear idea of how we do research really well. What are the considerations that we need to be putting in place when we're actually doing research? Well, first of all, research is, and this is my own kind of thinking about doing my own research, I see it as a systematic, theoretically informed, could be quantitative theories, it could be qualitative theories, and particularly an ethical examination of a particular phenomenon or phenomena in a social context. Because most of us are talking about education research, and inevitably, of course, that's a highly social context. So that's going to become a part of the considerations that you make. It's a process of research that is a process of steps that are used to analyze information to increase our understanding of a particular topic or a particular issue. We're going to talk more about coming to that topic or issue in a moment. So first of all, what are the steps that we go through? Well, I mean, we could explain this in many, many different ways, but one of the ways that the authors of the text put it forward is that we first of all pose a question. We then review the literature, and that will be something that we'll be talking about further as the course goes along, and an assignment is actually attached to that whole process. We specify a purpose for the research. Now that could go somewhere, anywhere actually, and these look like nice, neat steps, but in fact when you're doing research they can have, there may be kind of an iterative way in which this all unfolds. But once you've reviewed the literature, you'll have a clearer idea of what the purpose of your research is going to be. And we'll talk about that more as the course goes along. You'll also be collecting data, of course. Once you determine the purpose of the research in your own specific question, you're going to collect data, and there are many ways in which you can do that, and we'll be talking about some of those. And then once you've collected your data, you need to analyze and interpret that data. Now, all of these things, collecting the data, analyzing and interpreting the data, and so on, are attached to a particular methodology. And later on in the course, we're going to be talking specifically about methodology. But essentially what methodology is bringing together the theory of research and the practice, the actual doing of research. And so we'll talk about that further as well. And reporting and evaluating research, of course, is a very important part of that methodology as well. The important thing to remember is that research is not simply an opinion. It's not simply common sense understandings. Now, it may end up being mirroring, in fact, your opinion or common sense of some previously held knowledge. But research may in fact confirm previous knowledge, but it also offers opportunities for seeing things quite differently, understanding more deeply, and understanding things in a more complex way. So that's what research offers us, is the opportunity to think differently about, or at least question the kinds of common sense understandings or opinions that we or others may have about various aspects of the education process, for example. Perhaps the most difficult and important step in any research project, and it can be a pretty tortuous project, so I'll warn you right now, it takes time, and that's perfectly both understandable and very common. But is coming to a decision rather on what we are actually trying to research. What is the question that we want to actually examine? Creswell and Guterman provide us with some key questions to ask ourselves as we work our way through from the general to the specific in identifying our research question. And they go into much more detail, of course, in the reading, but just in general, what is the specific controversy or issue that I need to address? And sometimes it can be very current. It can be something that's coming up in your board right now. It can be a controversy out in the community. It can be something that is in the news presently, etc. Or it might be something that has happened in the past and you're seeing undercurrents of it in your own experience and you want to know more about it. So there are various ways in which you become conscious of that specific controversy or issue that you want to address. The next question you need to ask yourself is, why is this problem important? You don't want to spend your time on something that's going to just kind of be on a shelf somewhere, but is this problem important not only to you but to others in supporting the work that they do, or in adding to the understanding that they might have around a particular issue? How will my study add to what we already know about this problem? And this is where literature search comes in, of course, because what do we already know? Well, maybe people say certain things in magazines and newspapers and that sort of thing, but what does the research actually tell us about this particular issue or controversy already? And it may tell us certain things, but there might be things that are missing from that whole discussion. And that can lead us then to the question you want to ask. And lastly, who will benefit from what I learn about this problem? Will it be my own practice? Will it be the students in my class or in my school? Will it be policymakers? Will it be the community itself? There are various ways in which hopefully the research that we do benefits others. As you do your research, therefore, you will go through a process that helps you both in coming to the question and that helps you respond to your question by working your way through from the general to the specific question you wish to explore. They give us an example of that process that's quite helpful as indicated here. So the overall topic, the more general topic is online learning. The research problem within that topic is lack of students enrolled in online learning. So that's something that we've noted in communities or colleges or whatever. The purpose statement then becomes, this is what I wish to do, this is what I hope to accomplish, is to study why students do not enroll in online classes at a community college. Well, that's pretty broad. Where would you even begin with a question or with a purpose like that? So then you begin to refine it into various kinds of questions that you might ask. And one of those questions then may be something that isn't actually addressed in the research, or it's something that's of particular interest to your particular community or institution. And that becomes your research question. So in this case, does the use of the internet deter students from enrolling in an online class? So that is one way of approaching it. In my own case, for my doctoral work, for example, I began with the general area of women in leadership. It was something I'd become interested in as a woman and as a woman in leadership. And the research problem was, why are there not as many women in leadership and education as their overall reputation in the broader educational community? My purpose then was to explore why more women do not take up leadership in educational organizations. And the specific question I explored was, what are the forms of resistance encountered by women in becoming leaders in educational organizations? So you see that we're moving then from the more general to the specific. Now, what may appear to be fairly straightforward, and this arrow would suggest that you start here and you end here, and in a way that's true. However, it can take a considerable amount of time, and one of your guided tasks in this course is to begin that journey in identifying your research question. And you may visit several topics over time, because you may find that you aren't able to come up with a research question that's actually researchable, or there's already been so much done in that area that there's not much reason to continue with research in that particular context, and so on. So this is a process that you may revisit over and over again until you have refined it to this point and you're ready to go forward in making choices about how you're actually going to do your research. And that takes us to the next step, which is thinking about how you're actually going to approach your research. Key to successful research is the knowledgeable use of theory. And that is what your last reading in this module by Creswell talks about. As we become researchers, it's important that we become very self-reflective, particularly in our use of theory. Now, this might seem like an odd point to make, but it's important to recognize that we all come to research with a particular theoretical perspective or epistemological position. And by epistemology, I simply mean, how do we know what we think we know? How we kind of step back from that knowledge that we think we have, and how can we justify to someone else that that in fact is knowledge that's trustworthy and that we can use in a trustworthy way? Well, we all come with a set of lenses, if you will, with which we examine phenomena around us. Our lenses may be clouded, they may be partial, they may be culturally bound, etc. Theories, when we can identify them, may enable us to see differently, more clearly, more fully. So it's kind of a metaphor for, a kind of metaphor rather, might be, for example, when you go to the optometrist and, those sliding lenses that they put in front of you. So you start off rather clouded because in front of you are all of the experiences, all of the belief systems that you hold. And then as they remove them more and more, you begin to see more clearly, because some of those things that have prevented you from seeing what it is that you're examining clearly in front of you have been removed. Now, how does that happen in research? It happens by examining for ourselves the theoretical perspectives that we use every day in making decisions around what's justified actions, for example, in a classroom, what's appropriate interactions between the community and our own interactions on Meet the Teacher Night, or whatever it happens to be. There are 1,000,001 of them. But theories, when we begin to recognize that there are multiple lenses actually that we can use, we then can identify those theories, and those theories can actually enable us to see differently, more clearly, and sometimes more fully. So that's essentially what theories are all about. Pat Thompson is a professor at the University of Nottingham, and I'm quoting her here. And she happens to be a friend of mine, and she's a former principal from Australia. And I find her work so interesting because much of her current work explores the myriad processes that everyone goes through in doing and writing research. She looks particularly at the doctoral process, but there are implications for a variety of other people that do research. She happens to write an excellent blog about this process as well, in which she provides very accessible and a very accessible entry point into doing and writing research. Recently, she's done a whole series on what she calls theory fright. Now, this sounds kind of far-fetched, but I remember clearly several years ago I was teaching a course called Theories of Educational Administration. And I remember one of my students, you start off, it was a face-to-face class, so you start off by, what are your hopes for this course, and what do you hope to learn and apply to your own practice, etc. And she said to me, and to the class, she said, when I told people what I was going to be learning about over this summer, she said they were just said to me, oh my gosh, that's going to be so hard, and that's going to be so terrible. And, theory, and these were her exact words, theory is eerie. And so we all had a bit of a laugh about that. And by the end of the course, theory had been kind of assessed and found not so scary after all. But Pat wrote this series on theory fright because, in fact, that's exactly how most people approach this whole notion of theory. But from her perspective, she comes up with just a simple way of thinking about theory. A theory is just a way of explaining or of coming to an understanding of saying how things relate to each other, why they are the way they are, and how they relate to other things. Now, if you think about that statement, you begin to realize how fraught with an overlay of various understandings could be placed on what it is that you're seeing, how things relate to each other, and why, and so on. because you're looking at it through your own experience, through your own lens, through your own cultural understandings, etc. So what theory does, academic theory, is it identifies those issues that cloud our understanding. And what it does too is to lessen that theory fright, because it allows us, in fact, to see things differently and to analyze them in a way that's much more enlightening. So it's safe to say that students often approach the study of theory with some fear and trepidation. And although that's the case, and that's the case often because the language is often dense, rather difficult to understand, and it's talking often about esoteric concepts that seem not to be part of how we make meaning or understand the world we live in each day. And you'll find this when you read Creswell, I think, for most of you. In fact, however, we're always using a theoretical lens, as I've already tried to argue here, to interpret our experience. And what Pat boils down is the meaning of theory using this more simplified definition that I think takes some of the fear out of it. The language itself that's used to talk about theory can be a bit off-putting, and sometimes I see in the forum and so on some complaints about that. But we've all gone through it, and you come out the other side with a far better understanding of it all. So while you might have that experience reading this Creswell article, never fear, and don't worry if you come through it and you think, I don't have a clear understanding of what he's talking about. We will be revisiting much of that, and you will have a chance to revisit those concepts, and it does come clear over time, I promise you. Pardon me. Theory generally comes out of two ways of seeing social phenomena and organizing our understanding of what we're seeing. There's a quantitative stream and a qualitative stream, and both of these are well-known approaches to research. We're going to be talking about this in much greater detail later on in the course. But Creswell lays out some very good foundational knowledge. So let's look at some of the important points that Creswell makes in more detail in the article. First of all, he notes that quantitative, or as some people call it scientific research, looks at variables, and he talks about the various kinds of variables. So this kind of research looks at these variables and their quantifiable relationships with one another. These variables are used in the formation of theories that may be related to answer a research question or form predictions or hypotheses. So these theories may be formed based on variables in the past that have already been scientifically explored, and then those theories then are reapplied to answer a new research question or form predictions or hypotheses about that particular phenomena. Theory is used deductively, that is, it's used at the beginning of a study to test or verify the data as it's examined throughout the whole process of doing the research. Qualitative or naturalistic inquiry, as it's sometimes called, and you'll read an article about that later in the course, recognizes that social phenomena may be understood more fully through, for example, ethnographic, observational research, where broad explanations of behavior and attitudes are explored, or through using a particular theoretical lens or perspective, such as critical theory, feminist theory, etc., or and that has advocacy sort of slant to it, or the qualitative research may actually have an endpoint of that is, theory may be an endpoint of the qualitative research. So here we're talking about things like grounded theory, which starts from the general and then comes to a more specific notion of the theory that will help explain this phenomena in the future. Mixed methods are relatively new. There was an understanding for a while that quantitative and qualitative were totally different, divorced from one another, and the two just don't have anything to do with one another. But mixed methods use both quantitative and qualitative theoretical approaches to both explain and understand a social phenomena. So for example, in my doctoral research, I used statistical research, that is quantitative research, to identify that there was indeed a disparity in the number of women and men in educational leadership that could not be explained by the actual numbers of men and women participating as teachers in schools. So why was it that there were way more women than men as teachers, but way more men than women as leaders? So that raised then something that I wanted to understand more fully, which then led me to qualitative research, where understanding was the goal. So the quantitative explained something, that is, it verified something, but it didn't help me to understand. And what qualitative research does is it helps us to understand. Sorry. Okay, so clearly research is a complex process, but one for which there is lots of guidance in both the literature and in programs such as this one. So this leaves us with the question, why do research at all? Well, first of all, it helps us understand the world in which we live, whatever part of that world we happen to inhabit, how it's organized. So here we're talking about educational leadership, for example, or organizations, and who does the work in them and why, that sort of thing. How our actions affect others, how we can live well with others, how we can come to know the other, that is, come to understand other cultures, other experience, those who have a different experience of the world. This becomes very important in education, for example, for those who are teaching children from other cultural backgrounds, or working with people with other cultural backgrounds, or are teaching in a community that has a predominance of a different cultural background, and so on. And there are a whole range of ways in which this plays itself out around class, race, ethnicity, language, etc., sexual orientation, and so on. How can we work more efficiently and more effectively? Research also helps us to develop policies and governance at the local, provincial, national, and international level that work well in achieving the common good through social institutions. So when we're doing research, we can influence both the micro level, our school, our particular classroom, the meso level, so it can be at the community level, or the macro level, it can be at the larger organizational level, like boards of education, or even national or international organization, where levels of human activity need to be understood better. So welcome again to Edu 510. I'm looking forward to taking this journey with you. I'm going to provide guidance as well as other instructors in future courses as you move towards becoming an independent and knowledgeable researcher. At any time in this journey, you are more than welcome to seek assistance through email. You can ask me for a Skype call or whatever is going to work best for you. So I wish you all the best as you embark on a new year, a new course, and a new opportunity as an educational researcher.